Hi, this is Andre. We're going to do another live performance analysis video looking at using a few different types of looping functions and techniques to get song structure happening in a live looping performance, building up different contrasting sections and switching back and forth between them. We're also going to look at two different takes of the same song. Part of the concept at work here with these song structure looping videos is looking at the approach of taking loops that may not be related to a song initially, but finding grooves or key centers or feels that you can then take and use as the foundation of a pre-composed tune. So it's in some ways very, very meticulously planned and composed and constructed ahead of time, and in other ways it leaves a lot of room for spontaneity. And the two takes that I came up with for this particular tune were very different from each other, so this is a good opportunity to demonstrate some of the possibilities for getting radically different interpretations of the same basic material. As always, we'll start with a live performance. This tune is called The Proposition. I've been playing it since at least 2004, and afterwards I will talk about myself. One of the things I was happiest with about this particular take of the tune is that I managed to pull off what 95% of the looping world has to do every time they loop, which is hit record, play a phrase, stop record, hit overdub, and add stuff on top, which is basically looping 101 for almost everybody else in the world. Because I like some really geeky effects and techniques on this one particular live looping device, I like to go crazy with a lot of the mad scientist stuff, especially when I'm starting a loop, but it is honestly kind of a relief to know that I can actually pull this kind of thing off and still sound okay. One other quick point of reference that I don't think we've talked about before is that I'm actually beginning recording by hitting the loop 1 button. It's not a dedicated record button, it's the MIDI button for loop 1, but if you hit the loop 1 button and you don't have anything going, if you're in general reset like I started with here, then it starts recording. So it's a nice way of being able to get a little more functionality out of the same bank and not need to have a dedicated record button on this bank, but still be able to start a loop from scratch using it. So this is building up the initial loop here, and then overdubbing additional layers on top. Now we're copying into loop 2, adding a few more overdubs. And now getting ready to add the bass line in. There were a few more repetitions going on before I added the bass line than I would have liked. I guess I was a bit of a space cadet during this take, but oh well. Now I'm about to start overdubbing part of the melody. The structure of this tune, as far as how it's arranged for looping, is a little weird in the sense that some of the melody repeats every 4 bars and some of the melody does not. I didn't actually plan it that way. I realized it was structured that way after I had already recorded a studio version of the tune, and when I was trying to adapt it for solo live looping, I realized that the melody began with the same phrase every time, which is maybe really lazy composing on my part, but I thought it would be interesting to have that repeating element as part of the loop and then find ways of adding stuff that I could do on top or in addition to that. So this is going to be the first pass of the melody. I'm doing a long pressive overdub, and this is another thing I don't know we've talked about very much, but if you have overdub set to toggle and you do a long pressive overdub, then it becomes a sus overdub, and that simply means that it will stop overdubbing as soon as you release your foot. For this particular tune, there's a very small window of time between when I want to stop overdubbing a phrase and then keep playing a phrase that is not going to be overdubbed. So for that, I mentally find it easier just to do a sus overdub. I do a long pressive overdub when I start playing the phrase, and then I release the foot from the overdub pedal when I get to the point in that phrase that I do not want to have added into the loop. In the first verse here, you have the same beginning line happening every 4 bars. So when that loop is happening, when the same line is repeating every 4 bars, I'm doubling the bass line on the guitar, and then when the line that's in the loop stops playing, then I play the remainder of the melody live. So it's kind of switching back and forth very quickly between doubling the bass line and then playing live melody. If you look at the LED, at the light on the face of the EDP where it says input right underneath the L in Echoplex, that lights up whenever there is a live performance input. So whenever you see that lighting up, that means I'm playing something live on the guitar. If that's not lighting up, that means that all of the sound is coming from the EDP at that particular time. So just in general, because we're not doing split screen 2-camera shoots with this stuff just yet, keep an eye on the input light, and that will show you when I'm playing live and when it's just the EDP playing back. Now Now we're briefly switching back to loop 1. This is something I do in a ton of my tunes. I'll switch back to loop 1 just to break up the monotony, just to give at least a couple of bars of a break. In this case, I'm not doing anything with the loop necessarily. I'm just changing back to it just so that we can have a chance to breathe before we dive back into verse 2. Now verse 2, the main difference here is that in verse 2 I'm harmonizing the line that was overdubbed into loop 2. On the first verse I was doubling the bass line while that part repeated each time, but this time I'm playing live harmonies on the guitar while that part is playing, and then after that part stops playing in the loop, I'm playing single lines. Now jumping back to loop 1 and getting ready to create the second primary section in this tune. And the melodies for this are much longer than the initial loop, so we're using Multiply to extend the initial loop length out to be long enough to accommodate the length of the melodies. This particular section here is just standard issue looping 101, overdub stuff on top and harmonize different layers. And up until we get to the end of this particular section, that's all that's happening. Overdub is staying open and I'm just adding different stuff. Multiply to bring the length down to a shorter length because we're about to transition into the third part of the tune. Mainly adding in some overdubbed harmonics, doing a bit of a harmonization. There's also a split second where I hit the replace button because I thought I made a mistake, but it didn't get rid of the mistake I thought I made, so it's just what happened, and I had to keep going. And now we're bringing feedback all the way down while we overdub. The left-hand continuous controller pedal, the volume pedal style continuous controller, is set up on the MIDI pedal to control feedback. And bringing feedback all the way down means you only get one repetition of the loop. So in conjunction with bringing feedback down for one time through the loop and adding a new overdub, you can completely transform the content of the loop very quickly. And relatively seamlessly. You know, it's not the kind of thing with like the sus replace where it's really obviously glitchy and the transition happens very abruptly and it's a very angular sound. I like being able to bring the feedback down because it just, you know, it's like doing a very quick crossfade. And this is the third section of the tune. It's structured very much like the second section in the sense that it's primarily just overdoubling layers and then adding more stuff on top. ending the third section basically the same way we ended the second section, using a combination of remultiply, overdub, and feedback. But instead of transitioning into something else at this point, this is just the end of the tune. So just bringing feedback all the way down and just overdubbing a couple of last lines. Now we're going to look at another take of the same tune. One of the things to keep in mind is that even though there are a lot of differences, the textures and the loops are different, it's a lot faster than the previous take was. There are a lot of variation, but there's also a lot of stuff that's very consistent. The melodies are the same, the bass lines are the same, and even more importantly, I would say the loop functionality is the same. The way that we're using different looper functions to create contrasting sections and switch between those sections and create some structure, that is exactly the same. I'm not going to do an analysis of this second take because as far as the song structure stuff, it's the same thing that I did in the previous take. I will have some closing thoughts and some deep philosophical meditations after this second performance, so be sure and stay tuned for that. So I mentioned a little while ago that one of the concepts for arranging this tune for live looping is that part of the melody repeats the same every 4 bars, so that part gets added into the loop. One of the biggest issues I come up with in arranging something for a live performance, something that I'm going to do in front of an audience, is how do I keep things interesting? How do I strike a balance between adding enough stuff to the loop that I'm not just playing over a static loop and doing a real-time karaoke routine, but on the other hand, I don't want to be spending so much time manipulating just the loop that I'm just standing there and the audience is watching me step on pedals for 5 minutes. I do think a lot, and I have thought a lot about the visual aspect of the live performance. And I say this as someone who has been completely horrified by my body for most of my entire life. But you know, my feeling is that if you're going in front of an audience, unless you're completely hiding behind a curtain or something, then they're seeing you. And the way that you appear, the way that you present on stage is going to have an effect, or it can have an effect, you know, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that gives us a lot of power as performers to think about how we want to frame the music that we're making. I started standing up because I didn't like the idea of being this cliched guy sitting down at a looper. I wanted to stand up and present a different kind of on-stage energy, so that's why I started doing that. I've also found that sometimes you can get looping things that sound great as a recording that you listen back to after the fact that would not hold up very well as an actual live performance in front of an audience that was watching you. You can do a lot of great stuff that sounds great just as a recorded performance, but just asking the audience to sit there and watch you twiddle knobs is something that I try and avoid, and everybody does that. All the greats of live looping do that. Everybody does it. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying that it kind of bugs me when I find myself doing it for too long, because I just feel like it breaks the spell, even if only for a split second, even if for the best possible reasons, it's still kind of breaking the spell. So I try and find a balance between, on the one hand, doing enough live playing on the guitar that I'm keeping things interesting for the audience, but on the other hand, adding enough to the loop and making it dynamic enough that I don't just set up a backing track and then just play over that static backing track for several minutes. And I don't feel comfortable doing the real-time karaoke thing, so I try and make sure that I'm doing enough that is obviously adding content to the loop, but still also playing enough guitar that it becomes interesting. So a lot of the arrangement decisions, a lot of the compositional decisions for these solo live performance tunes actually come from that. A lot of it comes from a performative sense and from a visual presentation sense, and trying to come up with stuff that, you know, of course I want it to sound good musically, of course I want it to make sense as a musical statement, but I'm also thinking about, you know, looking reasonably interesting while I'm on stage. There's a ton of stuff that I've taken directly from DJ culture in terms of how I approach live looping, and one of the ones that comes into play a lot when I'm doing live arrangements of tunes is the idea of the remix, and the idea that you could kind of think of a remix of a tune as being a way of kind of breaking it down or deconstructing it and finding some aspect of it to investigate. If you hear a remix of a tune, you're not necessarily expecting that you're going to hear the entire tune in the same way that you normally would. And for this particular tune, as I mentioned earlier, this started as a recorded tune, and the actual structure of the tune is very different from how I do it live. And I arrived at the live arrangement and the live structure largely just as a result of finding stuff that seemed to work well as a live looping performance. You know, some of the sections that happen relatively briefly in the original studio version of the song get repeated a lot more in the live version. Some of the things that repeat several times at different points in the song only happen once in the live performance version. And a lot of it comes from the idea that if you're hearing a remix or a variation on something, you're not necessarily expecting to hear the tune as it originally was. Part of this also comes from, it's a combination of DJ culture and acoustic singer-songwriter culture. For me, when you're talking about those types of performers, you're not necessarily thinking about going out and hearing them play their latest and greatest hits. That can be an aspect of it, certainly, but speaking as somebody who kind of came of age in the late 80s and 90s, listening to popular music and rock, it was very much about if you were going to see a gig, they were doing a tour for a particular album or a particular release. There was a period where rock bands that toured without having a new album to promote were actually looked at kind of suspiciously. I remember one person criticizing Don Henley for doing a tour when he didn't have a new album and saying that he was cashing in, which I thought was great because it implies that if you're doing a promotional tour to promote a new release that is for sale, then that's not cashing in. No diss to Don Henley or anybody else. It's just something that I remember reading years ago and it really struck with me. But getting back on track, Andre, part of it is the idea that if you go and see a particular DJ spin or you go and see a singer-songwriter do their thing, you're going more, I would say, to experience their overall aesthetic and kind of engage with them as a performance personality, so to speak. It's not really with the same kind of expectation of you need to hear the hit song or you need to hear this or that or the other thing. It's, to me, it's more about going there and knowing that you're going to get a certain kind of aesthetic and a certain musical personality, and exactly how that stuff gets conveyed may differ from one gig to the next. That's what I've tried to do as far as structuring my live performances. You know, it's not so much about feeling like I've got to present something in a particular way. It's more about, you know, trying to figure out the essence of what I do and find ways of being able to recreate that in a live situation that is inspiring for me to play and hopefully interesting to listen to and to watch. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. I will talk to you guys very soon. I hope you're all doing well out there. It's July of 2020 and COVID is still very much a thing. So I hope everybody is staying safe and I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.